A customer at my cafe screamed, "Your baby is being born across the street right now, and this is what you're doing." I was making a vanilla latte when this woman started screaming at me from across the counter. Her face was bright red like she had been running. "Your baby is being born across the street right now, and this is what you're doing." I finished pouring the milk and looked at her confused. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job." That's when things got crazy. She actually came around the counter, which customers can't do, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. Her nails dug into my skin through my work shirt. "Come on," she said, pulling me toward the door. "You've been absent during this entire pregnancy, but you won't miss your daughter's birth." I tried to pull away, but she had a death grip on me. My manager, Roberto, just stood there with his mouth open, not helping at all. "Ma'am, I don't have a wife, and certainly not a pregnant one," I said, trying to understand what was happening. She huffed and pulled me harder. "Yeah, because you never bothered to meet Carolina or the rest of her friends and family," she spat back at me. My brain was spinning trying to think of any Carolina I knew. I went through every girl I had talked to in the last year. Nothing. No Carolina at work or gym or anywhere. "I never met a Carolina before," I said. She stopped at the cafe door and turned to stare at me. "You better not say that in the delivery room." Before I could argue more, she dragged me across the street to the hospital. The emergency room was crowded, but she marched straight through, passing everyone to the maternity ward like she owned the place. At the registration desk, there was a young nurse with a butterfly tattoo on her wrist who looked up and immediately frowned at me. "So that's the guy?" the nurse asked. "The crazy woman." "Yes, that's him," the woman said. "Can you believe how irresponsible and toxic he is? He doesn't even remember her name." The nurse shook her head at me like I was the worst person alive. "Room 367. Everyone's waiting for you." I wanted to run, but the woman still had my arm in her iron grip. She pushed me into the elevator and pressed the button for the third floor. When the doors opened, there was an older couple standing in the hallway. The man was tall and bald with arms like tree trunks. The woman was shorter with the same nose as the crazy lady who kidnapped me. "You must be Carolina's parents," I said, hoping they would be reasonable. The father's face turned purple. "Shameful," he growled, and then actually spit on my shoes. The mother just stared at me with pure hatred. "How dare you show up now after everything you put our daughter through?" I was about to explain I had no idea what was happening when a younger guy came out of a room at the end of the hallway. He was built like a football player with blonde hair and a jaw that looked like it could cut glass. He walked straight up to me and without warning punched me in the face. Pain exploded through my jaw and I tasted blood. I staggered back against the wall holding my face. "Sorry," he said, cracking his knuckles. I needed to get that off my chest. "Who are you?" I mumbled through the pain. "I'm Miguel, Carolina's boyfriend," he said. "The one who's been there for her while you pretended she didn't exist." Every person I met kept giving me these death stares. A doctor walked by and shook his head at me. A pregnant woman in a wheelchair actually hissed. Nobody believed me when I said I didn't know who Carolina was. Finally, Miguel pushed me toward room 367. "Get in there, she's about to give birth." The delivery room was chaos. Nurses ran around with equipment and machines beeped everywhere. There was a woman in the bed screaming, but I couldn't see her face because of all the medical staff around her. A doctor in blue scrubs pointed to a chair in the corner. "The father sits there until we're ready," he said. I sat down, still holding my sore jaw. The screaming got louder and then suddenly stopped. A baby's cry filled the room. The nurses were cleaning something and wrapping it in a pink blanket. "You can come see your daughter now," one of them said to me. My legs felt like jelly as I walked toward the bed. As I got closer, the medical staff moved away, and I finally saw the woman's face. Everything clicked at once. The room started spinning. Carolina, I knew her. That house party 6 months ago when I was completely drunk. We had kissed by the pool, and then nothing. I blacked out and woke up at home. I never saw her again or even remembered her name until now. "Are you crazy?" I said, staring at her exhausted face. "I want a paternity test done right now." She laughed weakly. "There's no need. Miguel is infertile. I went to that party specifically looking for a father." I froze. "What?" "I'm only telling you now because I'm going to need child support," she said, holding the crying baby. "Congratulations, Daddy." I looked around. This isn't happening, and I started to leave. Her father blocked me. His chest was inches from mine, and I could smell coffee on his breath mixed with hospital antiseptic. Carolina's mother tightened her grip on my other arm, her fingers digging into the bruises she had already made dragging me here. I looked between them, trying to figure out if I could push past them without getting hurt worse than I already was. The father was bigger than me by at least 25 kilograms, and he had that look people get right before they hit someone. My brain was calculating how much trouble I would be in if I fought my way out versus how much danger I was in if I stayed. Behind them, Carolina was saying something to the nurses, but I couldn't hear because of the blood rushing in my ears. The baby was still crying that newborn cry that sounds like a car alarm. I tried to sidestep toward the window, but the mother moved with me, blocking that path too. They had me cornered, and they knew it. Miguel positioned himself between me and the door, and his face changed from that angry look to something else I couldn't read. He put his hand on Carolina's father's shoulder and pushed him back a step. "Let him go," Miguel said, and everyone in the room went quiet except the baby. Carolina's father turned to look at him like he had grown a second head. "This needs to be handled through lawyers, not like this," Miguel continued, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. "You can't keep him here against his will. That's kidnapping or something." Carolina's mother let go of my arm, looking confused. "But he needs to take responsibility," she said, and her voice cracked. Miguel shook his head. "He will or he won't, but you can't force him. Not like this." I didn't wait to hear more. The second her fingers left my arm, I ran for the door. I ran past Miguel and the father who tried to grab me, but missed out into the hallway where other hospital rooms had their doors open and people stared as I ran by. The elevator was too slow, so I took the stairs, going 2 steps at a time and almost falling twice. My work shoes weren't made for running, and they slapped loud against the concrete steps. I burst through the ground floor exit door and kept running through the parking lot. Cars honked as I ran between them without looking. My jaw was throbbing where Miguel had punched me, and each breath hurt in my chest. I didn't look back to see if anyone was following me. I just ran past the hospital, past the cafe where I was working an hour ago when my life was normal, past 3 blocks of stores and restaurants, past people on the sidewalks who turned to watch the crazy guy running like someone was chasing him. I finally stopped in a convenience store parking lot 6 blocks away and bent over trying to breathe. My whole body was shaking so hard I thought I might throw up. My arm hurt where Carolina's mother had grabbed me, and I could see red marks forming that would definitely bruise. I pulled out my phone, and my hands were shaking so much it took 3 tries to unlock it. I scrolled to Mom in my contacts and hit call. It rang twice before she answered. "Hi, honey, what's up?" Her normal voice made something break inside me, and I started crying right there in the parking lot. "Mom, something really bad just happened," I said, and the words came out all shaky and wrong. I tried to explain about the woman dragging me from work and the hospital and Carolina and the baby and Miguel punching me, but it all came out confused. She kept saying, "Slow down, breathe," but I couldn't go slow. She said she got pregnant on purpose, I finally managed to say. She said she went to that party looking for someone to be the father because her boyfriend can't have kids. Mom, I don't even remember her. I was so drunk that night, I blacked out. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. "Where are you now?" she asked, and her voice had changed to that mom voice she uses when things are serious. I looked around. Some parking lot I don't know. A convenience store on 4th Street, I think. "Stay exactly where you were," she said. "I'm getting in the car now. We'll figure this out together because what she did isn't right. You hear me? This isn't your fault." I sat on the curb, still holding my phone after we hung up. My mom lives 2 hours away, so I had time to kill. I opened the browser on my phone and typed "someone got pregnant while blacked out drunk" in the search bar. The results that came up made my stomach hurt, article after article about consent and whether drunk people can consent to sex. I clicked on one from a legal website. Then I searched reproductive coercion because I had seen that phrase in one of the articles. A whole page of results appeared. Apparently, there are actual legal words for what happened to me. The articles talked about consent and bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. One article said that intentionally getting pregnant without the other person's knowledge or agreement is a form of assault in some places. Another talked about how men can be victims too, even though people don't normally think of it that way. I sat there reading on my phone while people went in and out of the convenience store, giving me strange looks. This wasn't just some crazy situation, this was potentially a crime against me. My mom's car pulled into the parking lot 1 hour 45 minutes later. She must have been speeding the whole way. She got out and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and I started crying again. "Let me see your face," she said, pulling back to look at my jaw where Miguel had hit me. It was already swelling and probably turning purple. She looked at my arm next where the finger marks were dark red against my skin. "We're going to the ER right now," she said. "We need to document this." I started to argue that I was fine, but she gave me that look that means don't even try. We got in her car and drove back to the hospital. I had just run from a different entrance, this time the actual ER. We checked in at reception, and I had to explain to the nurse what happened. She took photos of my jaw and my arm with a camera. Then a doctor came in to examine me. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and glasses. He asked me careful questions about what happened, who hit me, who grabbed me, if I had agreed to go to the hospital. "So you were physically forced against your will?" he asked, making notes. I nodded. "You should file a police report," he said, looking up from his clipboard. "What happened to you isn't legal. The assault, the false imprisonment, none of it." We left the ER with paperwork documenting my injuries and drove straight to the police station. It was almost 8 p.m. by then, and I was exhausted, but my mom insisted we do it immediately. The cop at the desk looked bored until I started explaining what happened. Then he looked skeptical. He kept interrupting to ask questions. "Why didn't you just leave the hospital?" he asked for the third time. I tried to explain how I felt trapped with Carolina's whole family surrounding me in an unfamiliar building, how her father was blocking the door and her mother had my arm, how Miguel had punched me, and I was afraid of getting hit again. The cop wrote it all down, but I could tell he didn't really get it. He probably thought I should have just pushed past them or called security or something. He took my statement and the paperwork from the ER and said someone would be in touch. I didn't believe him, but at least it was on record now. My mom wouldn't let me go back to my apartment. "What if they show up there?" she said, and I realized she was right. Carolina's family knew where I worked, so they probably knew where I lived too. We drove to her house, and she set me up on the couch with blankets and pillows. I lay there in the dark after she went to bed, but couldn't sleep. My brain kept trying to remember that party 6 months ago. I remembered going with guys from the gym. I remembered the house was big with a pool in back. I remembered taking shots in the kitchen. Then nothing, just blank, empty space where memories should be. I tried so hard to picture Carolina's face before today. I tried to remember talking to her, or dancing, or anything, but there was nothing there, just black. I must have passed out or blacked out, and someone took me home somehow. I never knew anything happened with anyone. I never knew there was a Carolina, and now there was a baby. My brain couldn't make sense of it. I called work the next morning before my shift started. Roberto answered on the second ring. "Hey man, are you okay?" he asked before I could say anything. "I saw that woman drag you out yesterday. What the hell was that?" I explained everything. The hospital, the baby, Carolina admitting she did it on purpose, Miguel punching me, running away. Roberto was quiet for a minute after I finished. "That's insane," he finally said. "Like really insane. You were literally kidnapped from work." "I know," I said. "I filed a police report and everything." "Good," Roberto said. "I'll back you up. I saw the whole thing. She came around the counter and grabbed you, and you were trying to pull away. I'll give a witness statement if you need, and don't worry about work. Take the time you need." I thanked him and hung up, feeling slightly less alone. I spent the rest of the morning on my mom's couch with my laptop researching family law attorneys in the area. Every website I clicked made me feel more hopeless. Consultation fees were 200, 300 euros. Some didn't even list prices, which meant they were definitely too expensive. Retainer fees were even worse, 3,000, 5,000 euros. One place wanted 10,000 euros up front. I made barely above minimum wage as a barista. I had maybe 800 euros in my savings account. Most of these lawyers cost more per meeting than I made in a week. I kept looking anyway, writing down names and numbers, trying to find someone I could afford. My mom came in and sat next to me. "How bad is it?" she asked, looking at the screen. I showed her the numbers. She was quiet for a minute. "I have some money saved," she said. "For a new car, but this is more important." I didn't want to take her money, but I also knew I couldn't fight this alone. I nodded, and she grabbed her phone right there, pulling up a list of family law attorneys she had already researched. She started calling them one by one, asking about consultations and availability. The first two couldn't see me for over a week, but the third had an opening the next morning. She booked it, and then called 2 more places, scheduling meetings for the following day. I sat there watching her take control of this mess, feeling like a child again, instead of a grown man with a job and his own apartment. That night, I barely slept, going over what I would say to these lawyers again and again in my head. The next morning, my mom drove me to the first consultation in a glass office building downtown. The waiting room had leather chairs and a water fountain that made annoying dripping sounds. A secretary led us back to meet the lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit who looked bored before I even started talking. I explained everything from the beginning while he checked his phone twice. When I got to the part about being completely drunk and not remembering anything, he held up his hand. He told me I should just make a payment plan with Carolina because fighting this would cost more than child support. I mentioned that she admitted doing it on purpose, and he shrugged, saying that didn't matter once a baby existed. My mom asked about reproductive coercion, and he actually laughed, saying that wasn't a real legal concept for men. We left after 15 minutes, and I felt sick, like maybe everyone saw it this way. The second consultation the next day was at a smaller office across town. This lawyer was a woman about 40 who at least listened to the whole story without interrupting. She made notes and asked good questions about the timeline and what Carolina had said at the hospital. When I finished, she leaned back and admitted she didn't have much experience with cases like mine. She had mostly handled divorces and custody disputes between married couples. She said I needed someone who specialized in reproductive rights and men's issues. Then she wrote a name on her business card: Dr. Quentin Flair, 2 towns over. She said he had argued cases about reproductive fraud before and would understand what I was dealing with. My mom called his office from the parking lot and got an appointment for that afternoon. We drove 40 minutes to a residential area where his office was a converted house with a small sign in front. Inside, it didn't look anything like the fancy places we had been. Mismatched furniture filled the waiting room, and stacks of legal books covered every surface. A young guy at the reception desk told us to go straight back. Quentin's office was equally cluttered with files stacked on chairs and sticky notes covering his computer monitor. He looked younger than I expected, maybe 35, with glasses and a wrinkled shirt. But when I started explaining what happened, he didn't check his phone or look bored. He just listened, leaning forward with his elbows on his desk. I told him about the party, the blackout, waking up at home with no memory. I told him about being dragged to the hospital and Carolina's admission that she had done this on purpose. I told him about Miguel punching me and her family spitting on my shoes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said this was exactly the kind of case he took. He explained that yes, I was probably the biological father based on what I described, but he said the circumstances of conception mattered legally and ethically. He talked about demanding a paternity test through proper channels, documenting the lack of consent, building a case that child support should be reduced or structured differently because of reproductive coercion. He used that exact phrase, and it made me feel less crazy. He said we would argue that what Carolina did violated my reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. The retainer fee was €3,000, which made my stomach drop, but Quentin said he would do a payment plan because he believed in this case and wanted to set legal precedent about consent and conception. My mom pulled out her checkbook and wrote a check for €1,000 as the first payment. I signed paperwork that made everything feel terribly real. Quentin said he would send a formal letter to Carolina through the hospital address demanding a court-ordered paternity test and putting her on notice that we were contesting any support claims. He would document everything, including her admission about intentionally seeking me out as a sperm donor. We left his office, and I felt like maybe someone finally understood this wasn't just about avoiding responsibility. 2 days after that horrible day at the hospital, Quentin sent the formal letter. A week later, Carolina's lawyer responded demanding full child support calculated from my income. They wanted 40% of my salary plus half of all childcare costs and half of all medical expenses. I did the math sitting at my kitchen table. 40% would leave me with just enough to cover rent and food. I would have to get a second job or move back to my mom's house permanently. The amount seemed deliberately punitive, like they were trying to destroy my life for not going along with Carolina's plan. I drove to my mom's house that night because I couldn't stand being alone with those numbers in my head. She opened the door and looked once at my face before pulling me inside. I sat on her couch and showed her the demand letter with shaking hands. She read it twice, and her face got tight and angry. I started doing the math out loud, calculating what 40% of my salary meant for rent and food and gas. The numbers didn't work no matter how I rearranged them. I would have to get a second job working nights or weekends just to survive, or move back here permanently and sleep on this couch for the next 18 years. My voice cracked when I said that part, and suddenly I was crying, really crying for the first time since all this started. My mom sat next to me and didn't say anything, just let me fall apart on her shoulder. The unfairness of it burned in my chest. I never agreed to any of this. I never chose to raise a child, didn't even remember the night it happened. But somehow I was the one being punished while Carolina got exactly what she wanted. I cried until my head hurt and my throat was raw. My mom made tea, and we sat until almost midnight talking about options. She offered to let me move back, but I could see the worry in her eyes about money. She was barely making it on her own salary. I couldn't become another burden for her to carry. The next morning, I met with Quentin at his office to discuss our response. He had already started drafting documents arguing for reduced support based on reproductive fraud. The document was thick, full of legal language about consent and bodily autonomy. He showed me sections citing the forum posts where Carolina discussed seeking alternative options for having a baby. Other parts referenced her admission at the hospital about going to that party specifically to find a father. Quentin explained we were requesting that support be calculated at a lower percentage given the circumstances. He also wanted custody arrangements to be minimal and supervised only, arguing that I had no relationship with this child and the conception involved trauma. I signed the papers authorizing him to file everything with the court. He said the response would go to Carolina's lawyer within 48 hours. Part of me felt guilty for fighting against supporting a baby who didn't ask to be born into this mess. But another part knew I couldn't let Carolina completely destroy my life just because her plan worked. 3 days before our court hearing, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Miguel. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice sounded different from the hospital, lower and less angry. He told me he had been thinking a lot about everything about what Carolina said in that delivery room, about the forum posts I found about how she acted during the whole pregnancy. He said he was moving out of their apartment and ending the relationship. His voice got hoarse when he said he had finally accepted she had manipulated both of us. Then he said something that made my heart race. He was willing to testify at the hearing about what Carolina had told him about her intentions, about how she admitted Miguel was infertile and she needed to find someone else, about conversations they had during the pregnancy where she seemed more focused on getting financial support than anything else. I asked why he was doing this, and he was quiet for a minute. Then he said, because it's the truth, and I'm tired of protecting someone who used me as much as she used you. We talked for almost an hour about logistics and what Quentin would need from him. When we hung up, I immediately called Quentin to tell him about Miguel's offer to testify. Quentin sounded excited, saying Miguel's testimony could be huge for our case. The courthouse was cold and echoey when we arrived for the hearing. Quentin carried a briefcase full of documents while I tried to keep my hands from shaking. Carolina sat on the other side of the courtroom with her lawyer, a tall woman in an expensive suit. Carolina didn't look at me. Miguel showed up 20 minutes before we started, waving to me from across the room. The judge was an older man with gray hair who looked tired. Carolina's lawyer went first, painting me as someone trying to escape responsibility. She talked about the baby's needs and my obligation as the biological father. She made it sound like I knew about the pregnancy the whole time and just didn't care. My jaw clenched listening to her twist everything. Then Quentin stood up and started presenting our evidence. He showed the forum posts where Carolina discussed wanting a baby despite Miguel's infertility. He read parts of her hospital admission where she said she went to that party specifically looking for a father. He talked about consent and reproductive coercion and bodily autonomy. The judge leaned forward, actually paying attention. Then Quentin called Miguel to testify. Miguel walked to the witness stand looking nervous but determined. Under oath, he confirmed he was infertile and had been in a relationship with Carolina. He described conversations where Carolina talked about her options for having a baby. He testified about what she said in the delivery room about intentionally seeking me out. Carolina's lawyer objected several times, but the judge let Miguel continue. When Quentin asked about the forum posts, Miguel confirmed he had seen similar conversations between Carolina and her friends about finding someone at parties. The courtroom felt different after Miguel's testimony. Even Carolina's lawyer looked surprised. Then it was Carolina's turn to take the stand. She looked small, sitting there, nothing like the confident woman from the hospital. Quentin asked about the forum posts, and she claimed they were just hypothetical discussions between friends. She said our encounter at the party was mutually desired and meaningful. But when Quentin pressed her for details, her story started changing. First, she said we talked for hours, then she said it was more like an hour. She couldn't remember what we supposedly talked about. Quentin asked why she never tried to contact me after the party if we had such a meaningful connection. Carolina stumbled over the answer, saying she lost my number. But then Quentin pointed out she never asked for my number according to her own earlier statement. She said she got it from a mutual friend, but couldn't name the friend. Her lawyer objected again, but the damage was done. Carolina kept contradicting herself, getting defensive and angry. She insisted everything was my fault for not remembering her. Quentin asked about her admission at the hospital, that she went to the party looking for a father. Carolina tried to claim she was confused after giving birth, that she didn't mean it that way, but her voice wavered, and even the judge looked skeptical. When she finally stepped down, she was crying, and her lawyer looked frustrated. The judge called for a recess, and everyone stood. I thought we would get a decision immediately, but instead the judge said he was appointing a court psychologist to evaluate all parties. Her name was Dr. Julieta Milan, and she would provide recommendations about custody and support arrangements. The evaluation would take 4 weeks, which meant waiting even longer for answers, but Quentin looked pleased when we left the courtroom. He said the judge ordering an evaluation meant he was taking the reproductive coercion seriously. If he had dismissed our arguments, he would have just decided immediately. 4 weeks felt like forever, but it also gave us more time to build our case. Miguel caught up with us in the parking lot and asked how I thought it went. I said his testimony clearly made an impact. He looked relieved, like he had been worried about doing the right thing. We shook hands before he left, and it felt strange to have this connection with someone who punched me just months ago. Julieta's office was in a medical building downtown with plants in the waiting room. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with glasses and a calm way of speaking. The evaluation session lasted 2 hours. She asked about my memory of the party, and I admitted I had none. She asked how I felt about having biological responsibility for a child I never agreed to create. I was honest about the trauma and confusion about feeling violated, even though society didn't recognize men as victims in reproductive situations, about my conflicted feelings toward a baby who existed because someone used my body without consent. Julieta listened carefully and made notes, but never seemed judgmental. She asked what kind of relationship I could imagine having with this child, and I said honestly I didn't know. Maybe someday when I had processed everything, maybe never. I didn't feel like a father. I felt like a victim being forced into a role I never chose. She asked about the support demand, and I showed her my budget, explaining how 40% would make it impossible to survive. She asked about my job and plans, and whether I had ever wanted children. I said maybe someday with someone I chose when I was ready, but not like this. Never like this. When the session ended, Julieta said she would meet with Carolina and Miguel separately over the next 2 weeks. Miguel texted me after his evaluation saying Julieta had asked detailed questions about Carolina's behavior during the pregnancy, about statements Carolina made about intentionally seeking a sperm donor, about the forum posts and conversations with friends. He said Julieta seemed to understand this wasn't a typical paternity case, that there were layers of manipulation and consent issues that mattered. Miguel felt hopeful after his session, and that made me feel slightly better too. At least someone in an official position was taking this seriously instead of just assuming I should accept everything. My therapist had suggested for weeks that I join a support group for men dealing with reproductive coercion. I had resisted because part of me felt ashamed about the whole situation, but after the evaluation with Julieta, I decided to go. The group met in a church basement on Tuesday nights. There were 6 other guys there, ranging from early 20s to maybe 50. Each of them had stories about being trapped by pregnancies they didn't agree to. One guy's girlfriend had lied about birth control. Another had a one-night stand where the woman said she couldn't get pregnant. A third had been told by his girlfriend she had an IUD when she didn't. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone and less crazy. Society didn't talk about men as victims in reproductive situations, but it happened more than people realized. We weren't deadbeats trying to escape responsibility. We were people whose consent had been violated in ways that had permanent consequences. The group leader talked about setting boundaries and processing trauma, about the difference between biological responsibility and emotional readiness, about how we could fulfill legal obligations without pretending to have feelings we didn't have. Walking out of that church basement, I felt lighter somehow, like maybe I wasn't broken for struggling with something everyone said I should just accept. My mom called me the next afternoon, sounding confused. She said Carolina's parents had tried to contact her directly. They had called her work number somehow and asked if they could talk. My mom refused to get involved without lawyers present like Quentin had instructed, but she said they sounded different from before, less hostile and more confused. They kept asking questions about what really happened at that party, about whether I really didn't remember Carolina, about the timeline of events. My mom said Carolina's mother had sounded almost apologetic, though she hadn't actually apologized. It seemed like Miguel's testimony at the hearing had planted seeds of doubt about their daughter's version of events. They had invested so much in believing I was the villain that questioning Carolina meant questioning their own actions, the spitting and death stares, and the assault they allowed. My mom said any communication needed to go through Quentin and hung up, but she said something in their voices had changed, like maybe they were starting to see cracks in Carolina's story. 2 weeks later, Quentin called me to his office because Julietta's evaluation report had arrived. I sat across from his desk while he flipped through the pages, his expression getting more positive with each section he read. The report was 20 pages long with detailed notes from all the interviews and review of evidence. Julietta had written that the documented reproductive fraud was a significant factor that should influence support obligations. She recommended establishing payments at a lower percentage that would increase slowly as my income grew over time. The report also said I should have only supervised visitation rights if I chose to pursue any relationship with the child. Julietta had included an entire section about trauma and consent violations, acknowledging that I had the right to set boundaries around a situation I never agreed to. Quentin looked at me and said this was exactly what we needed. The report gave us strong support for everything we had argued in court. He made copies and started preparing for the next hearing scheduled in 3 days. I left the office feeling something I hadn't felt in months, like maybe the system was actually listening to what happened to me instead of just assuming I should accept everything. The courthouse was packed when we arrived for the hearing. Carolina sat at the other table with her lawyer, not looking at me once during the entire proceeding. The judge came in, and everyone stood. Then he started reviewing Julietta's report out loud. He read the sections about reproductive fraud and consent violations, nodding as he went through the recommendations. Carolina's lawyer tried to argue the report was biased and didn't adequately consider the child's needs. The judge cut her off and said the child's needs were important, but so was the context of how the child came to exist. He issued a temporary order right there setting support at 20% of my income instead of the 40% Carolina had demanded. The order included a clause saying the amount could be changed if evidence of fraud was proven in criminal court. Then the judge granted the restraining order against Carolina's family for the assault and harassment. He looked directly at Carolina and said she needed to stop all social media posts and public harassment immediately or face contempt charges. My hands were shaking as I wrote down everything the judge said. 20% was still a lot of money, but it was manageable with my current job. I wouldn't have to move back home permanently or get a second job just to survive. Quentin squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom. The next step was filing a formal complaint with the district attorney about what Carolina did. Quentin drove me to the DA's office downtown in a building with metal detectors and security guards everywhere. We sat in a waiting room for an hour before a prosecutor finally called us back. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s who looked tired and overwhelmed. Quentin explained the whole situation while she made notes showing copies of the forum posts and Carolina's hospital admission. She listened carefully, but her face told me she wasn't optimistic. When Quentin finished, she put down her pen and said honestly, criminal prosecution for reproductive coercion was extremely rare. The laws weren't clear and juries had trouble seeing men as victims in these situations. She said she would open a case file and document everything we brought, but I shouldn't expect charges to actually be filed. Quentin had warned me this would probably happen, but hearing it still hurt. The prosecutor said having an official complaint on record would help our civil case and document the harm done. She gave me a case number and said to contact her if I remembered any other details about that night at the party. Walking out of the DA's office, I felt frustrated that the criminal system wouldn't help, but also relieved that at least someone official had written down what happened to me. 2 months after that horrible day at the hospital, I finally moved back to my own apartment. My mom helped me pack my things from her house and drove me home. The apartment felt different somehow, like I was seeing it with new eyes after everything that happened. I unpacked slowly, putting things back where they belonged and trying to reclaim my space. The reduced support payments were manageable with my barista job, though I still worked extra shifts on weekends to build savings. Quentin had warned me Carolina might try to modify the order later if her situation changed, so I needed a reserve in case court costs came up again. I set up automatic payments so I didn't have to think about it every month. The money went to an account for the baby, and I tried not to picture where it actually went or what it paid for. My therapist said it was okay to fulfill my legal obligations without getting emotionally involved, that I could send money without pretending to have feelings I didn't have. Being back in my own place felt like taking back control of my life piece by piece. Miguel started texting me every few weeks just to check how I was doing. At first, it felt strange to have any contact with someone so connected to Carolina, but gradually, I realized we had this shared experience that nobody else really understood. We met for coffee one afternoon, and he told me about his therapy sessions. His therapist was helping him process how Carolina had manipulated both of us for her own purposes. Miguel said he was starting to date again, but being very careful about trust and honesty. He had learned he needed someone who valued mutual respect instead of just using him as a provider while she did what she wanted. We talked about how society really didn't have language for what happened to us. How men being victims of reproductive coercion wasn't something people took seriously. Miguel had joined a support group similar to mine and found it helpful to talk with other guys who went through similar things. By the end of coffee, I realized we had actually become friends in this unlikely way, bonded by being manipulated by the same person. He texted me later that week about a basketball game, and we made plans to go together. 3 months after the temporary order, Carolina made one final attempt to contact me directly. A long message appeared on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. She must have gotten a new phone or borrowed someone's to get around the restraining order. The message went on for paragraphs about how she did everything out of love for the baby and couldn't understand why I was being so difficult. She said the baby deserved a father who cared, and I was being selfish, putting my own feelings first. She claimed she never meant to hurt anyone and just wanted to raise a family. The message made my stomach turn because even now she couldn't acknowledge what she had really done. There was no apology or recognition that she violated my consent, just more excuses and blame shifting, making herself the victim of my supposed cruelty. I screenshot the entire message and forwarded it to Quentin without responding at all. He replied within an hour saying this was perfect evidence of continued harassment despite court orders. Her complete lack of understanding about why what she did was wrong just confirmed I had made the right choice maintaining boundaries. I blocked the number and tried to forget about it. 6 months after that horrible day at the hospital, I was in a much better place mentally and emotionally. Therapy had helped me process the trauma in ways I didn't think possible when everything started. I had learned to set firm boundaries with people and situations, understanding I could fulfill my legal obligations without sacrificing my own well-being. The support group continued to be helpful, giving me a place to talk about things most people didn't understand. My therapist helped me see I didn't need to pretend to have feelings I didn't have just because society expected certain emotions from biological parents. I could acknowledge the reality of the situation while also protecting myself from further harm. Work was going well, and Roberto had mentioned possibly promoting me to shift supervisor. The regular customers who witnessed the harassment had become protective of me in this sweet way, always asking how I was doing. I had started dating again, cautiously, being very upfront about my situation and the importance of clear consent and communication. It felt good to be excited about my future again instead of just surviving day by day. The judge called us back to court for a final hearing to make the temporary orders permanent. Quentin had prepared a thick folder of evidence, including Carolina's harassment message and documentation of her continued social media posts despite warnings. The judge reviewed everything carefully before issuing his final order. He kept the reduced support structure at 20% of my income, with the same clause about possible modification if criminal charges were filed. He also made the supervised visitation rights permanent, but emphasized they were rights I could choose to exercise, not requirements. Quentin explained after the hearing that this was actually a significant victory for our side. We had established legal precedent that reproductive fraud mattered in determining parental obligations. Other lawyers could now cite this case when arguing similar situations. The judge had recognized in his written order that consent in conception was a relevant factor, not just biological paternity. Quentin seemed genuinely proud of what we had accomplished, even though I still felt conflicted about the whole situation. Leaving the courthouse that day felt different from all the other times, like maybe this chapter was really closing. I spent a long time thinking about whether I should pursue visitation rights now that everything was legally settled. My therapist said there was no right or wrong answer, just what felt authentic for me and my situation. I talked to Miguel about it, and he said he would support whatever decision I made. My mom wanted me to at least meet the baby once, but she also understood why I hesitated. After weeks of consideration, I decided not to pursue visitation for now. I needed to focus on my own healing and building a stable life for myself. The trauma of how this child came to exist made it impossible for me to separate those feelings from any potential relationship. Quentin assured me I could reconsider the decision in the future if my feelings changed. He said there was no legal or moral requirement to have a relationship with a child created through violation of my consent. That validation from my lawyer helped me feel less guilty about my choice. I would fulfill my financial obligations because the law required it, but I didn't have to force an emotional connection that didn't exist. 2 weeks after the final hearing, a letter arrived at my apartment from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal written apology from Carolina's parents. They acknowledged they had acted on false information and expressed regret for the assault and harassment. The letter said they had learned more about what really happened at that party and realized their daughter hadn't been honest with them. They apologized for the spitting and death stares and for allowing Miguel to punch me. The apology felt genuine in a way that surprised me, like they had actually reflected on their actions. I sat with the letter for a few days trying to decide how to respond. Eventually, I wrote back through their lawyer accepting the apology, but explaining I wasn't ready for direct contact. I asked Quentin to keep the restraining order in place even with the apology. Just because they felt bad now didn't erase what they had done or make me feel safe around them. People who were so quick to violence based on one person's story weren't people I wanted in my life. The restraining order would stay in effect, and they would stay away from me and my workplace. That boundary felt necessary for my continued healing and safety. 3 weeks after the court's final order, Roberto called me aside during my shift and said I was promoted to shift supervisor with a €2 raise. He said he was impressed with how I handled everything with dignity when most people would have completely fallen apart. The promotion meant more responsibility, but also more money and better hours, which helped me feel like my life was actually moving forward instead of staying stuck. The regular customers who witnessed the harassment also started treating me differently. Sonora Silva, who came every morning for her black coffee, started bringing me homemade pastries twice a week. The college students who studied at the corner table always made a point to ask how I was doing, and one of them even offered help if I needed anything. It felt strange to have this unexpected support network at work, but also comforting to know people were on my side after everything that happened. My mom used what was left of the lawyer fund to book us a cabin in the mountains for a long weekend. We drove up on a Friday after my shift and spent 3 days hiking trails and cooking meals together. On the second day, we climbed to a lookout point and sat on the rocks talking about my plans for the future. She asked if I was thinking about going back to school or maybe finding a career path beyond the cafe. I said honestly, for the first time in months, I was actually excited about my life again instead of just trying to survive each day. The legal battle was over, and I could finally think about what I wanted instead of constantly defending myself. We talked about maybe taking some business management classes at community college so I could work toward managing my own cafe someday. 6 months after the mountain trip, I started dating again, but was extremely careful. On first dates, I was upfront about my situation and why clear feelings and communication mattered so much to me in all aspects of relationships. Some women got uncomfortable and never called back, which was fine because I needed people who understood boundaries. Others listened and asked thoughtful questions and seemed respectful of what I went through. It was scary being vulnerable about what happened, but my therapist said the right people would understand and the wrong ones would filter themselves out. I went out with 4 different women over those months, and while none turned into serious relationships, I learned I could trust my judgment again. 1 year after that horrible day at the hospital, I was genuinely okay. I had my supervisor position at the cafe and was enrolled in 2 business management classes at community college. My apartment felt like home again instead of a place where I was hiding. I still saw my therapist monthly, but the panic attacks had mostly stopped. I had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or forgiving Carolina for violating my consent. It was about reclaiming my autonomy and refusing to let someone else's actions define my worth or control my future. The baby existed somewhere in the world as a biological fact, but I had made peace with my decision to maintain boundaries while fulfilling my legal obligations. My life belonged to me again, and that was what mattered most. Yeah,